Okay, let's do this. So let's start with a simple observation. Humans kind of tend to panic when things don't make sense. And there's a famous quote by my guilty pleasure, Mr. Shlomo Freud. It goes something like this: neurosis is the inability to tolerate ambiguity. So what that basically means is that when identity is inconsistent, or when social ties dissolve, or when their place in the world isn't mapped clearly, then people kind of tend to freak out and develop neurotic habits. But what do I mean by coherence and cohesion, and how do they connect? Well, coherence is the inner logic of the self. So your thoughts, values, feelings, narratives that are kind of neatly stitched together in this like tidy, explainable bundle or box. So it's the story that you tell yourself about who you are and why you do what you do. And it's kind of what makes you feel like a person rather than a kind of chaotic swarm of impulses and contradictions. So cohesion, on the other hand, is external, right? It's the social glue. It's what binds you to others, like shared language or shared rituals or, whatever, spooks. Okay, so cohesion says you belong here with these people in the structure. So it's kind of like your passport to the symbolic order, like the collective reality where you have a name and a role and a function and so forth. So these two kind of work together like a codependent couple. Okay, so coherence gives you an I and cohesion gives you a we, and together they give you a sense of safety, not necessarily happiness or freedom, but safety, predictability, and a place to stand. But here's the problem. Neither coherence nor cohesion is real in any ultimate sense, but it is sold to us as though it is. So these are fabricated, they're maintained, they're ritualized, and they're often weaponized. And to talk about this, I want to share with you one of my absolute favorite passages from a book that is super important to me. This is a quote by Jacques Lacan, and it helps us understand something important about truth by negating Cartesian logic. So this is what he's doing right now. He's kind of negating the statement of the whole I think, therefore I am shit. So I'm going to read you the quote. So Lacan says, what the I think is directed towards, and so far as it lurches into the I am, is a real. But the true remains so much outside that Descartes then has to reassure himself of what, if not, of an other that is not deceptive, and which shall into the bargain guarantee by its very existence the basis of truth. Guarantee him that there are, in his own objective reason, the necessary foundations for the very real, about whose existence he has just reassured himself, to find the dimension of truth. I can do no more than suggest the extraordinary consequences that have stemmed from this handing back of truth into the hands of the other. So at first glance, and I felt the same way, the quote kind of looks like a tangle of French cerebral acrobatics, okay? But it hits at the heart of the issue. So the moment the I tries to affirm its existence, so I think, therefore I am, it already panics, right? It needs a guarantee. It needs a backup. It needs an other to step in and say, yes, you exist, and yes, your reality makes sense. And that is where truth gets kind of outsourced. So it's no longer something discovered or experienced directly, but something that's handed back to us, and it's certified and sealed by an external authority. So let that sink in for a minute. Truth becomes a social product in this case, which is a spook, right? So something that is maintained through collective belief and ritual repetition and symbolic validation. So it's not that you are, it's that you are recognized as. And so coherence, which is something kind of like internal unity, and cohesion, which is something like external belonging, are not natural states. Okay, they're performances that are constantly surveilled and stabilized by this mysterious other, which Lacan calls the big other. So this is society, culture, God, science, your therapist, your followers, your algorithm, whatever. So the shit that you sort of submit to attain an identity which makes sense to you. But what happens when you stop receiving that validation? So when coherence breaks down and cohesion kind of slips away, then you don't just feel confused, right? You feel ungrounded. You start grasping for new spooks to stitch yourself back together. You become neurotic, not because you're flawed, but because you're addicted to guarantees, to legibility, to that old Cartesian reassurance, I must be real because something out there says so. So think about how much energy goes into appearing consistent, how we dread being called a hypocrite or fake, how quickly we backpedal when someone accuses us of contradiction. So we'd rather kind of flatten our complexity than be seen as unstable. So in Stirnerian terms, we become possessed by the spook of self-identity. So a self that has to make sense, that has to be knowable, both to yourself and to others. And cohesion, honestly, is even trickier. It's the stuff of nation states, family loyalty, workplace culture, identity politics, fandoms, friend groups, group chats, whatever. It demands compromise, and sometimes even complicity, sometimes even silence. So the cost of belonging is often the erasure of self-ownership. So why do we cling to these spooks so tightly? Because incoherence feels like madness, because discohesion feels like exile, because meaning, even if fake, feels better than none at all. But what if we could learn to enjoy incoherence? What if we could dance with discohesion instead of fearing it? What if instead of demanding a narrative arc, we embraced the ragged edges of our being? So the shifts and the reversals, so the I don't know why I did that kind of moments, right? Do you think that we would fall apart? Do you think that we would have to stop going to work? Do you think that we would just fall into the ground like that anti-pot smoking commercial where the girl just kind of sinks into the couch? Do you think that would happen? Or would you just be free and then go from there? But let's look at some examples for the need for coherence, because I think that's important here. So again, coherence is the spook of internal unity, right? It's the narrative glue that kind of tries to make the mess of life feel like, I don't know, like well edited. So it kind of tells you stuff like you're one stable self with one stable story, and everything you do has to align with that story. Otherwise, it will stop making sense, and then you will sink into the couch. Okay? So the person who says, I've always been like this, is kind of a disciple of coherence, right? They treat themselves like a novel with a set theme, rather than a scribbled mess of contradictions and whims and stolen bits from pop culture and God knows what. So the social media bio is a good example here, right? You're an artist, you're a feminist, you're INFJ, you're coffee lover, cat lover, whatever. So this is like a patchwork of tags that masquerade as identity. So these fragments create the illusion of a consistent self, or like a narrative arc. But as Stirner reminds us, these are all fixed ideas. These are spooks that possess you, right? They own you. So you aren't anything unless you own it back. Okay, that's the Stirnerian idea. So meaning can't define you unless meaning belongs to you. But the spook of coherence kind of flips the script. Instead of wielding your quirks and contradictions as tools that serve you, the Stirnerian idea is that you begin to serve them. So you contort your behaviors and your desires and even your memories to fit the story you've already told about yourself. And this is simultaneously the most difficult, but also from another perspective, kind of the most amazing and beautiful thing about being conscious, because we can actually make ourselves into things. We can mold our identity. But in a Stirnerian sense, none of that shit matters if you don't then own that identity. So if you don't see it as essentially that, according to Stirner, you are a creative nothing. And the only way to avoid that essential nothingness overcoming you to a point of despair, which ultimately ends in nihilism, or nihilism's slutty cousin, hedonism, you have to own your choices. You have to own your desires. You have to own your mask, not worship it, not beg for it to love you back, and definitely not confuse it with your own face. So you have to focus on making sure you approach every moment with self-ownership. Because here's the punchline. The moment you forget you're wearing a mask is the moment it starts wearing you. And coherence becomes your leash in that moment. So you stop being the one who plays with identity and you start being played by it. So this is why Stirner's creative nothing is so radical. It's not a void to be feared, it's a blank canvas. It doesn't ask you to be consistent. It doesn't demand that you explain yourself. It doesn't even care if your past contradicts your present. It just asks you, are you using this idea or is it using you? And that brings us back to Lacan's quote, right? So the tragic comedy of this modern self is that it keeps trying to anchor itself in something outside of itself. So in the big other's approval, in coherence and cohesion, and being true to what we think we are. But what if there is no truth to return to? What if there's no real self waiting to be unveiled? What if the truth is that there is no truth? What if all there is a creative nothing that makes things useful, that plays with things, and that owns things? So this isn't a call to nihilism, though it might kind of smell like it at first. It's a call to own your chaos, right? Not hide from it. It's to admit that your narrative is just that. It's just a narrative. And that liberation has to begin the moment you stop insisting on making sense. But obviously this is hard. So, when people express that, when people show that this is difficult, then there are, of course, great minds with power plays who are like, hey, the guy from Sesame Street who's like, oh my God, I just remembered that guy existed. That I think maybe that's just on German Sesame Street, but there's this dude who's like always walking up like, hey, you want to buy this? That's kind of how I picture that. Anyways, the trench coat guy, if anybody remembers, let me know, because I loved him. So these people kind of come in and in their, Mother Teresa agenda, they obviously want to make things easier for you, right? They don't want you to have to deal with the horrifying desert of the unreal, right? They want to help you with the painful nihilism-inducing reality of the creative nothing, So what did they offer? Well, this is what I'm calling cohesion here. So cohesion is a kind of solution to incoherence. It's sort of riddled in power mechanisms and diversions. So let's think about some examples of the need for cohesion. So cohesion is the glue of the social order. It's the demand that you fit in based on the idea of some ideal that is reasonably easy for people to attain. So in a way, you're a good little puzzle piece in the grand picture. And the grand picture is many things, like a nation or a community or a gender role. So for example, cohesion shows up in family rhetoric. So you can't do that because it will bring shame to the family. So the translation of that would be, your actions threaten our performative sense of togetherness. Then we have nationalism. So nationalism is a cohesion with a flag, right? Think Benedict Anderson's concept of imagined communities, where the nation is not a tangible body, but a shared hallucination that's kind of held together by ritual and repetition. And then we have things like workplace culture. So you don't actually have to like the motivational poster with the dog that's, skydiving or whatever, but you have to pretend to, because otherwise you're not a team player. And then we have, of course, the big one that's also mostly discussed in The Ego in Its Own, which is religion, right? Or organized spirituality, which are kind of the oldest cohesion factories. So we have rituals, communal symbols, and moral codes. And this is all totally okay, but they have to serve your ownness. But unfortunately, usually they demand obedience for the sake of harmony. And this is where Stirner says, away with every cause that is not altogether my cause. And that kind of radical stance of self-elevation above cohesion is so necessary. Because cohesion tries to solve the discomfort of living in chaos. So it promises something. It promises unity, stability, and purpose by kind of placing you neatly within a predefined structure. And it's a social contract. It's the idea that there's a safety net, there's a balm for the sting of alienation. And the problem is, this sense of belonging often comes at a cost, right? It comes at the cost of your individuality or your ability to form yourself out of the creative nothing through self-ownership. So take family values, for example, right? They insist on togetherness at the cost of personal freedom. So if you step out of line and if your behavior doesn't conform to the family narrative, which is supposed to prepare you for the world, right? It becomes a problem. Not because you've done something wrong, but because you've disturbed the illusion of cohesion. And this is kind of done usually by parents because they're, in a way, feeling like they're looking out for you. Unfortunately, what actually happens is they're just kind of minions for the social contract. So when you threaten the narrative that holds this unit together, it becomes problematic. And in this way, it shows you that cohesion demands conformity and turns you into a tiny part that has to function correctly to sort of work a much larger machine. And nationalism is kind of the same way, right? Like, as I already mentioned, Benedict Anderson talks about this. He argues with his concept of imagined communities that the nation is an artificial construct that's kind of held together not by tangible ties, but by shared beliefs and repeated rituals. So it's not the land or people that form the nation, it's the reaffirmation of belonging. It's the collective hallucination that's constructed through flags and anthems and customs. So you're expected to embody this cohesion, to wear the identity of your nation without question. Because to not do so is to risk being labeled an outsider and a traitor to the grand narrative. And at this point in time, if you were to do that, then you are kind of fucking yourself, because how are you going to survive, you know? Then we have workplace culture. So this is another spook factory, because it doesn't matter if you're not genuinely inspired by something, right? What matters is that you pretend to fit in. And of course, this isn't said directly, but is definitely instilled in you through this idea of cohesion. And by utilizing your fear of incoherence, right? So cohesion is about social currency in this place. It's about social capital. So a good team player is someone who contributes to the overall harmony of the group, even if that harmony is totally manufactured. So if you disrupt the cohesion, you're suddenly labeled as difficult or uncooperative, and worst of all, you know, something like out of place. So the danger of cohesion is that it often disguises itself as a solution to the discomfort of incoherence, as if belonging to something larger will somehow make us whole. But in reality, it demands that we relinquish ownership of our own identity, which turns us into representatives of the collective. So it's a subtle form of control. It's extremely subtle, actually. It's a kind of erasure of the self that's wrapped up in the illusion of unity. So yes, cohesion seems like the answer to the fragmentation of the self, but it just becomes another spook that locks us into a role that we didn't choose and that fully doesn't fit us. So the more you try to belong, the more you lose sight of who you really are. And to break free from this, you kind of have to question not just the systems that demand cohesion, but the very need for it itself. How rational, how much sense does this fear of incoherence actually make? But we're going to talk about that in just a minute. First, I want to talk about the fact that this is not just a sociopolitical phenomenon. It's actually backed by a shit ton of philosophies that actually highlight the need for coherence and the related need for cohesion. So take, for instance, the ancient Greeks and their obsession with logos, okay? So logos is reason, order, and unity. So Plato's ideal world, in which everything has a place and a perfectly harmonious structure, is the foundation of so much of the Western tradition. So here, coherence is not just a practical necessity, it's a metaphysical ideal. So the world of forms is the perfectly unified, coherent reality, and humans are simply trying to recall their true and unblemished and consistent selves through the process of philosophy. But what is this other than a grand desire to impose order upon the chaos of experience? Think about it. Then we have enlightenment, right? The Enlightenment era. So this is where we have the obsession with reason and individual autonomy, which kind of further entrenches the need for coherence. Think of Descartes, right? The idea that we can find certainty in our own minds and that there's an essential and coherent self that persists regardless of external circumstances. So the problem is that Descartes' emphasis on the thinking subject is the pursuit of a unified self that's detached from the mess of physicality and contradiction. So this need for internal unity fuels the desire to fit every piece of life into a rational, coherent whole. So it's kind of like the bedrock of modern individualism, right? Which insists that there has to be an identifiable and coherent I that remains consistent through time. And then we have the Bösewicht, as we say in German, Hegel, right? Hegel with his dialectical synthesis, where contradictions are resolved into a higher and more coherent unity. So the struggle for coherence, so for a seamless flow of history and identity, becomes a process of sublation, where all the messy, conflicting elements of existence are eventually reconciled into a grand and coherent whole. And even if Hegel's system is more sophisticated than what we talked about before, it still reinforces the idea that life, so in this case history and identity and thought and purpose, have to ultimately be understood as a coherent unfolding. And this isn't just abstract philosophy. It trickles down into every aspect of our lives. So the pervasive pull toward internal coherence and social cohesion is reinforced by every institution that we can think of. It's reinforced by every narrative that seeks to organize us into predictable categories. So this is gender, it's nationality, it's your career, okay? So every time we're told we have to be a certain way and align with a group or fit into a role, we're being nudged in a very calm way toward the same basic premise, which is that coherence and cohesion are essential to what it is to be human. So what happens then when we stop believing in the necessity of coherence, when we kind of reject the societal insistence on cohesion? Stirner would argue that this is where true freedom actually begins. Not the freedom of fitting into an identity or role, but the freedom of becoming untethered from these spooks altogether and to learn to play with them. So when we free ourselves from the need to make sense and to belong and to unify our existence into a stable narrative, then we come face to face with the terrifying but also exhilarating possibility of being without needing to justify it. And I want to kind of just really quick talk about existentialism, because although they critique it more than they actually celebrate it, obviously. So Sartre's notion of bad faith is a perfect example. So he argued that humans often try to impose coherence into their existence to make themselves into something fixed, because the alternative is terrifying. Right? It's nausea, what he calls nausea. So the desire to be coherent and to be something stable and recognizable is so overwhelming that we lie to ourselves and pretend to have an essence that is already determined, rather than accepting that we're free to define ourselves in every moment. And this is the anxiety that drives so many to seek cohesion, whether in religion, ideology, or even relationships. And in all of these cases, other than existentialism, cohesion is a tool used to supposedly fix the problem, when in reality it just ends up preserving the power of the collective. So it's an attempt to stitch individuals into a harmonious whole and to smooth over the messy contradictions of human existence. And Stirner calls that shit out. He says that no, what you're actually doing is being an egoist. And an egoist telling others that egoism is bad is the kind of hypocrisy that you can't get away with without losing the argument, obviously. So I want to give a more immersive experience here by picking out a spook that kind of really helps illuminate the shit that I've been trying to focus on here. And that will kind of be the focus of the rest of the episode. As an example, I spoke with one of the audience members and they asked me to talk about gender, specifically gender roles and ideas of masculinity and femininity. I have talked about gender a few times before. I'll link it in the description. And my main take on gender is pretty simple, to be honest. It's like, basically, it's the common post-structuralist idea that gender is constructed through power and discourse and desire rather than determined by nature. So basically, drawing on Foucault, I tend to argue that identities are formed through disciplinary systems that shape norms and self-perception. And I work with Lacan's concept of the mirror stage usually to explain how our gendered selves are formed through psychological concepts like alienation and misrecognition, and ultimately, we internalize the symbolic orders, roles, and meanings. But something maybe not so normie is that I mentioned that this process basically renders gender dysphoria not like an aberration, but a logical consequence of modern identity formation. So I don't see it as a psychological illness, as right-wingers would claim, probably. But I also don't see it as a product of some inherent biological truth. I see it as simply a reaction to a system of oppression that induces something in us. And that thing in us that's induced is the fear of death, which relates to our experience of physicality mixed with our concept of self and coherence. So I explained that essentialist appeal to biology function, as suggested by Erich Fromm, is actually kind of like a death-denying illusion. So they are psychological defenses that offer false stability in the face of existential uncertainty. Then, of course, we have the influence of capitalism that I like to focus on in this case because I think it's like really strong here. So this influence of capitalism kind of takes that fear and exploits it through aesthetic control and turns like bodily traits into commodified ideals and channels desire into consumerism. So this kind of ties in the Deleuzian angle that gender is best understood as a desiring production, so like a fluid becoming rather than a fixed being, and society represses this becoming to maintain control. So my claim when it comes to gender identity is that it's a spook in the Stirnerian sense. And while group identity can serve strategic political purposes, it also kind of risks becoming a new spook that ends up reinforcing conformity through guilt and hierarchy and moralistic discourse, especially when postmodern critique is weaponized by the left and the right. So ultimately, even rebellion in this sense can trap the ego in a new symbolic identity. And I think this is important because saying that gender identity has some root in biological truth or essence robs people of their incoherence and therefore robs them of their ability to claim coherence through ownness. So I think gender is a great example here because gender is one realm of discourse that's really popular right now and very disputed, where coherence and cohesion really kind of love to hook arms and, slow dance over your corpse. Okay, so what am I saying here? What I'm trying to say is gender as we know it is not just an oppressive social norm or a repressive tradition. It's a full-blown metaphysical trap. So it lures you with promises of identity, meaning, recognition, and community. But it ultimately binds you to a symbolic structure that demands coherence, so who you are, and cohesion, so who you belong to. So the spook isn't just the binary, right? The spook is the belief that there has to be a gender, that you must name and narrate yourself in order to be real, and that your ownership of whatever narrative you want has to be solid and consistent and coherent and socially applicable. So the idea isn't to say don't call yourself a man or a woman. Okay, the idea isn't to say don't conform to gender norms or defy gender norms if that's what you want to do. The idea is simply to remain the owner of your becoming. So to resist being captured by the expectation that you have to be legible to others in order to be valid, and that you have to be something in order to exist. So ownness means you can call yourself a man today and for the rest of your life if you want, or a woman tomorrow and nothing at all. And none of those positions become sacred. None of them become your master. You use the label, the identity, but you don't become it. But that is easier said than done, right? Let's be real. Because we want to feel solid. We want to belong. We want to be real. We want to be something in order to function. and that is the need for coherence and cohesion. So in the next part, I think we should have a look at where that comes from and why it is so fucking dangerous. So what are these needs? Where do they come from? Who told us we needed to make sense or belong? And why do we fear chaos more than domination? Let's first look at the psychological background. So in psychology, the need for coherence is often framed as an existential necessity. So here we can look at the work of people like Carl Rogers, who insisted on a kind of congruence between the self-image and lived experience. So for him, mental well-being was dependent on aligning your self-concept with your actual experiences. So to have like a kind of inner harmony. But as, R.D. Laing counters in his text, The Divided Self from 1960, this supposed congruence often produces the false self. This is what he calls it, the false self, which is a protective persona that's shaped not by one's own desires, but by social expectations. So I think in this case, we could look back at Stirner, and Stirner would likely say something like, if your mental health depends on being congruent with the spooks in your head, then sanity is just another name for obedience. So the need for cohesion, on the other hand, kind of ties into attachment theory. So we got Bowlby and Mary Ainsworth, who argued that stable, predictable social bonds in early childhood create the foundation for mental stability. And this could kind of explain the adult obsession with belonging and being seen. But again, who decided these were healthy attachments and not, chains forged in the nursery? And then we have modern psychology. So modern psychologists like Dan McAdams have described the self as a quote-unquote narrative identity. So we craft like autobiographical stories that give meaning and coherence to our lives. But then others would warn that narrative identity is always kind of caught between two poles, like sameness and selfhood. And I think that the egoist perspective would be, why privilege sameness when selfhood is actually a flux? But this is just the psychological narrative. I also want to take a look at psychoanalysis. So in psychoanalysis with Freud and Lacan and Wilhelm Reich and Erich Fromm and all kinds of other people, they basically say that coherence is not a given, but that it's a defense, right? So Lacan would argue that the subject is split. So we don't emerge as whole and stable, but kind of fractured through identity formation, formed through like a state of alienation in the mirror stage and kind of forever haunted by the gap between the imaginary and the symbolic and the real. So the coherent self is more like a fantasy that's sustained by language, and this is a necessary fiction, but also a fiction nonetheless. In Lacanian terms, we would also have to look at desire, right? Desire is not about attaining some stable identity. It's about circling around the lack at the heart of being. So when we demand that people know who they are, we're kind of essentially demanding that they cover over their own lack and stitch together a mask and wear it like it's their face. And from a Freudian angle, we would say the ego is built on repression and that identity is just one of its more socially acceptable symptoms. So where psychology might say, find yourself, psychoanalysis would say, there is no self to be found, right? There's only a void, and you have to learn to dance with it, and you have to learn to deal with it and make something out of it. And this is precisely where Stirner returns, right? The ego, or the unique, doesn't have a stable identity. It just appropriates, and it consumes, and it devours, and it plays with identity. So the egoist doesn't seek to integrate the self, but to own the fragments without worshiping, like, the thing that holds it together, like the glue. So in short, if psychology asks, who are you really? The psychoanalysis replies, you are your lack. And then egoism answers, you are what you take and leave behind. So the trick is not to fix your identity, but to loosen your grip on it. Because coherence is a cage and cohesion is a chain. And both are forged in the name of being whole. But maybe wholeness is not the goal, because maybe wholeness is a spook. But let's again look at philosophical concepts and developments that are at the foundation of this idea of coherence and cohesion. And this is where I want to talk about what I like to refer to as epistemological myths. So the need for coherence has a deep epistemological root. Okay, so we have rationalism, especially with figures like Descartes, kind of wanted to build knowledge on a clear, unified foundation. And from there, coherence became the gold standard of logical consistency. And philosophers built systems like towers, right? They kind of put each brick together in logical harmony with the next. So we have to think about philosophy, especially in relation to epistemology, as like a development that's greatly influenced by power dynamics. So coherence as a theory of truth is not just fragile, it's actually vacuous, right? It's without reference to experience. And this is where I am super grateful for Nietzsche. Because Nietzsche was laughing at this, like in a very direct and very influential way. So he was kind of like, we're not men of knowledge with respect to ourselves, right? We create narratives to like anesthetize chaos. But coherence is aesthetic, it's not truthful. So truths are illusions, which we have forgotten are illusions. And as much as I love to make fun of him, I also really appreciate Ludwig Wittgenstein, who kind of dismantled the idea that language can truly represent inner states. So in Philosophical Investigations, he reminds us that meaning arises from use, not from internal consistency. So to demand coherence is to impose a grammar on the unspeakable. Now let's look at cohesion. So cohesion, I always think, the first thing that I think about is the social contract. And the first philosopher that I think about is Rousseau, who very much idolized the idea of the social contract, which kind of imagines unity as natural and mutual. But of course, Jenna would like look at this and be like, a contract that's not freely entered is just another prison, obviously. So the general will that Rousseau talks about is actually like a spectral collective that crushes the individual. And I would say that even Habermas, in his theory of communicative action, believes in a utopian rational consensus where norms are justified through dialogue, right? So this is problematic, obviously, because consensus is a sly demand for cohesion. So I would refer to someone like Lyotard, who said in The Postmodern Condition, let us wage a war on totality, let us activate the differences. And what about power and social constructs? Because this has a massive influence here. Here I think we should look at Foucault and Butler specifically with the concept of gender. So Michel Foucault, especially in Discipline and Punish and the History of Sexuality, really unmasks how coherence and cohesion are products of power and not nature. So institutions discipline bodies into normal behavior through surveillance and repetition and categorization. And the modern subject is confessed. It's confessed and it's formed through confession into being. So coherence is not self-made at all. It's actually enforced. One of the best quotes by Foucault. I know I keep talking about how I love this man's quote. It's kind of fangirly, I'm sorry, but this is a great quote. It's very short, 4 words. Visibility is a trap, which means that to be coherent is to be legible, and to be legible is to be governable. Then we have Judith Butler. Since we're looking at the concept of gender, this is very important. Judith Butler weaponizes this insight that Foucault talked about in Gender Trouble and Undoing Gender. These are 2 books by her. So for Butler, gender coherence is a regulatory fiction. Okay, so we don't express gender, we perform gender. Over and over again, we cite norms we didn't create in hopes of recognition. So in a quote, she says, "The internal coherence of the subject is not the logical or analytic consequence of a set of sexed attributes. It is culturally enforced through discursive practices." So in other words, your gender identity is a rehearsed script designed to earn you a place in the social drama. So cohesion is the applause you get for sticking to your lines. But the danger is when you fail to cohere or you cohere wrongly, you risk being unrecognizable. And Butler talks about this by saying something like, to be called a girl is to be told that you will be one. So recognition is conditional upon subjection. And one more angle that I want to take here is that of the dynamics between structure and agency with Anthony Giddens and the trap of duality, because this is where the rebellion spook is kind of explained pretty well. And I think this is one of Stirner's greatest contributions. So Anthony Giddens, in his structuration theory, attempts to kind of resolve the age-old debate between structure and agency. So he says that structures aren't just external, they're internalized and enacted and then reproduced through everyday practices. So the idea is that you are the structure, right? Even as you act against it. And this means that agency is basically impossible. So he says something kind of like, the constitution of agents and structures are not two independently given sets of phenomena. They're actually a duality. And this is especially relevant to cohesion. So we don't just submit to social cohesion, we actually perform it into existence. And the rules of the game kind of live in our gestures and our speech and in our rituals. But here's the thing. If structure and agency are co-constitutive, then rebellion often just reinforces what it seeks to destroy. So to break gender norms loudly may still be to cite them. Okay, and this is why I find the left and the right very problematic in this way. So ownness isn't just about transgressing norms, it's about escaping the grammar of normativity altogether. So to conclude, the need for coherence and cohesion is not innate. It's historical, political, and strategic. It's imposed by power, performed through habit, and justified through spooks of logic, morality, and even love. And Stirner's challenge isn't to replace these needs with better ones. It's to dissolve the need altogether. Why be coherent if coherence is a leash? Why be cohesive if cohesion is a cage? So ownness is not a better self, it's the absence of all imposed selves. It's the void from which you create without having to justify what you are. Okay, for this part, I really want to get into an interesting quote by Deleuzo-Guattarian that really kind of offers a way to look at what it means to truly give up coherence and cohesion. Because I think most people are absolutely terrified of this. So it explains all the nuances of it really well in a complicated way, which is why we're going to go through the quote and just dissect it. And then in the last part, we can use that insight to draft an idea for how to approach it with agency by looking at what Donna Haraway has to say about that using the example of gender. So I'm going to read you this quote by Deleuze and Guattari from their text, 1,000 Plateaus. To become imperceptible oneself, to have dismantled love in order to become capable of loving, to have dismantled oneself in order, finally, to be alone and meet the true double at the other end of the line, a clandestine passenger on a motionless voyage, to become like everybody else. But this, precisely, is a becoming only for one who knows how to be nobody, to no longer be anybody, to paint oneself gray on gray. First of all, I want to summarize what I think they mean by becoming imperceptible. So in 1,000 Plateaus, becoming imperceptible is the ultimate mode of transformation. It's not the end point of development, but rather the collapse of the idea that there even is an endpoint. So it's not an evolution of the self, but more like a subtraction of selfhood, like an erosion of all fixed forms, representations, and coordinates. So Deleuze and Guattari aren't urging us to become invisible, not in the banal sense of hiding, at least. They're also not advocating for social withdrawal in a psychological sense. What they mean is a radical departure from representation. So this means to cease being a figure that can be interpreted and named and classified. So this is not a disappearance of matter, but more like a disappearance of signification. It's the opposite of coherence and cohesion, literally. And it's kind of the same as genus Ownness, like lived in the Deleuzian register. So let's look at the first. What does love have to do with this? So they say to become imperceptible oneself, to have dismantled love in order to become capable of loving. What the fuck does that mean? So this is kind of like the first rupture. It kind of reflects the paradox of affect under structure. So the question is, how can we love, like truly love, if love has already been loaded with cliches and roles and idealizations? So think of Lacan's notion that there's no such thing as sexual relationships. Why? Because we never relate directly. We relate through fantasy, through the symbolic, through the other's imagined desire. So to dismantle love is to remove the spook of love from love, okay? So it's to remove the institution of love. It's to remove the grammar of loving as recognition. And Deleuzo-Guattari say that only then we can actually love without subjectivity. So we can love as flow and not form. So the pure intensity of relation without the demand to be seen and possessed and understood. And I would say that in Stirnerian terms, only once love is no longer a fixed ideal or cause or higher essence of some sort can I truly enjoy it as my love, right? My property. Not true love, not romantic love, not selfless love, okay? Just my unrepeatable expression, which is an enjoyment that doesn't ask to be justified. Then the next part is, quote, to have dismantled oneself in order finally to be alone and meet the true double at the other end of the line. I don't know about you, but to me this sounds eerily Stirnerian. Like the ego for Deleuzo-Guattari is not a pre-existing center, but an aggregate of sedimented habits and roles. It's like a coagulation of social codes. So to dismantle the self is not to destroy some inner essence. It's more like to unbuild a house that you never actually designed. So there's a very famous quote where they say something like shit on your whole mortifying symbolic theater or something like that, which is a very direct expression of how much this pisses them off, right? How much they want out of it. So the true double is not a mirror image. It's the other you who has also escaped, if that makes sense. It's a fellow traveler in imperceptibility, not a friend, not a lover, not a twin, but more like a resonance, like a connection without coherence. So here the Lacanian mirror stage is reversed, right? It's instead of becoming an ego through reflection, you dissolve it and encounter a non-subjective post-identitarian communion. So the double is what emerges after both parties have renounced being one. Okay, now what about the clandestine passenger on a motionless voyage? So the voyage, I would say, is motionless because it moves through intensity and not through territory. Okay, so this is the heart of Deleuzo-Guattari's ontology. So desire is not lack. It's actually flow. It's like turning the negativity of the concept that Lacan showed us, that we constantly desire to be whole and we can never be whole. They take that and they reverse it and they turn it into something way more positive, you know? So desire isn't lack, it's flow. And flows don't need destinations. They just flow. So a life of becoming isn't a march toward clarity. It's like an ongoing ripple or a wave that refuses to crest. So to be clandestine is to no longer emit the signals that make you legible, right? Gender, race, class, status, trauma, all these produce perceptibility in a surveillance society. So when Deleuzo-Guattari say imperceptible, what they mean is escaping the grids, like the molar systems through which the state, capital, and psychoanalysis, in this case, detect and fix bodies. So this clandestinity echoes Shenna's insurrection, against visibility, because he doesn't want to be a recognized rebel. He doesn't want to be a revolutionary in the pantheon. He wants to vanish into enjoyment and into his uniqueness and into his consumption and ownership of the sacred, of the spooks. And then what do they mean by to become like everybody else? And how does this relate to the next part where they say, but this precisely is a becoming only for one who knows how to be nobody, to no longer be anybody. So this is a paradox, right? This line is most definitely a paradox. It sounds almost like Zen in a sense, to be indistinct, like water poured into water. But what does it mean to become like everybody else? So this is not about conformity. It's about anonymity. So in Stirnerian terms, this is the unnameable me, right? It's not being part of the group, but flowing with the swarm, in a sense. So to merge into the background, not out of fear, but because you're no longer a sign to be read. So here Deleuze and Guattari align with Spinoza. So the ethical life is one that increases your power to act, not your capacity to be recognized. In fact, recognition is often the theft of your becoming, right? So you become like everyone else only when you've relinquished the need to be someone in particular, like a gender or a story or a trauma or a brand or whatever. And paradoxically, only the one who no longer needs to be anything can flow freely through all things. And I think this connects really well to Taoist thought as well. So the quote is something like, the sage is like water, and water does not contend, but it shapes mountains, which is from the Tao Te Ching. So to be imperceptible is to be undefinable, untouchable, but also at the same time radically affective. Okay, now to the last part. What the hell do they mean by to paint oneself gray on gray? So the line evokes the aesthetic of pure desaturation. So in contrast to the Enlightenment fetish for clarity and visibility, Deleuze and Guattari embrace something totally different, the opposite. So in Kantian aesthetics, beauty is what pleases without concept. But gray on gray doesn't even please. It totally blends, right? It refuses to be art. It refuses to stand out. And Stirner mocks the heroic figure as well, right? The revolutionary moral man or the enlightened citizen. Because he writes, they say of God, names do not name him. That holds good of me too. No concept expresses me. Nothing that is designated my essence exhausts me. So to paint yourself gray on gray is to avoid capture. It's not self-erasure, but self-unavailability. So you become ungraspable, not by hiding, but by not protruding, right? Not resisting the gaze, but seizing to offer surfaces for its projection. And this is kind of post-egoist invisibility. So the ego consumed itself in the fire of ownness, and what remains is a shadow, like a streak, right? So I would say that this is a kind of imperceptible egoist that's being offered here. So Deleuze and Guattari don't name Stirner, but still this is very Stirnerian, what they're talking about. Stirner's ownness is a practice of disidentification. To be a unique one is not to assert some fixed essence, but to enjoy the dance of unsubmitting, right? The egoist is not some loud rebel, okay? And it's also not about soft refusal. So in The Ego and Its Own, he says something like, the unique is the one who's beyond the law, beyond God, beyond the state, and not in opposition, but in irrelevance. So Deleuze and Guattari's imperceptible kind of is Stirner's insurrection of irrelevance, right? It's a life lived without the need for name or norm or necessity. To not matter to anyone but yourself is to not be controlled. So let's try to find some final resonances. So to live imperceptibly is not nihilism, right? It's generative. It's unshackled. It's the desert of the real without mirage. It's egoism without identity, and it's love without ideal. It's existence without justification. It's living the poem that Stirner never wrote and the theory Deleuze and Guattari never finished. It's like a clandestine life, right? It's a gray trace. It's a body without shape. Or as Deleuzo-Guattari put it, you never reach the body without organs. You can't reach it. You are forever attaining it. It is a limit. So ownness is not a state, okay? It's a movement. It's an imperceptible drift on a motionless voyage. But how do we even approach this? What do we do with this information? Like, this quote is awesome to kind of dissect the idea, but how do you even go about this? Well, I think there's someone who tried this as a thought experiment and wrote about it, and I think it's worth taking a closer look. So in the next part, we're going to look for the second time, and we're going to, go deeper on this at Donna Haraway's A Cyborg Manifesto. So Donna Haraway, who is Donna Haraway? I'll just read you the Wikipedia because I don't feel like actually memorizing this shit. So Donna Haraway was born on September 6, 1944 in Colorado. Her father was a sports writer for the Denver Post. Her mother, who came from an Irish Catholic background, died from a heart attack when she was 16 years old. Haraway attended high school, blah, blah, blah. Haraway majored in zoology with minors in philosophy and English at the Colorado College on the full tuition Butcha scholarship. After college, Haraway moved to Paris and studied evolutionary philosophy and theology at the Foundation Teilhard de... I can't read this shit. Basically, she had a Fulbright scholarship. She completed her PhD in biology at Yale in 1972, and she wrote a dissertation about the use of metaphor in shaping experiments in experimental biology titled The Search for Organic Relations, an Organismic Paradigm in 20th Century Developmental Biology. Okay. Now I'll read you the part about A Cyborg Manifesto. So, in 1985, Haraway published the essay Manifesto for Cyborg, Science, Technology, and Social Feminism in the 1980s in Socialist Review. Although most of Haraway's earlier work was focused on emphasizing the masculine bias in scientific culture, she has also contributed greatly to the feminist narratives in the 20th century. For Haraway, the manifesto offered a response to the rising conservatism during the 1980s in the United States at a critical juncture at which feminists, to have any real-world significance, had to acknowledge their situatedness within what she terms the informatics of domination. Women were no longer on the outside along a hierarchy of privileged binaries, but rather deeply imbued, exploited by, and complicit within networked hegemony and what had to form their politics as such. In her updated essay, A Cyborg Manifesto, Science, Technology, and Social Feminism in the Late 20th Century, in her book Simian Cyborgs and Women, The Reinvention of Nature from 1991, Haraway uses the cyborg metaphor to explain how fundamental contradictions in feminist theory and identity should be conjoined rather than resolved, similar to the fusion of machine and organism in cyborgs. The manifesto is also an important feminist critique of capitalism by revealing how men have exploited women's reproduction labor, providing a barrier for women to reach full equality in the labor market. She later discussed her thoughts on A Cyborg Manifesto, Gender and Postgender in 2006, critiquing distinct and imposed categories. So, let us look at her essay. So in her essay, she states the following: a cyborg is a cybernetic organism, a hybrid of machine and organism, a creature of social reality as well as a creature of fiction. When I first read A Cyborg Manifesto, I thought it was fucking stupid because it was shown to me as a feminist sci-fi provocation manifesto, okay? But what it really is a very precise philosophical tool. So what it does is it deconstructs essentialism, it destabilizes identity, and it offers a framework for non-coherence, which I think is super, super important. So this is a kind of way to think of or to like form the idea of an identity beyond totality, hierarchy, and legibility. And it is precisely here in her concept of the cyborg that we can find a really unlikely bridge to Deleuzo-Guattari's Becoming Imperceptible and Max Stirner's Ownness. So first of all, in her introduction, she introduces the cyborg as a boundary creature. Okay, so this is a creature that's neither fully human nor machine. It's neither fully natural nor cultural. It's neither male nor female. So the cyborg explodes dualisms, right? Mind and body, self and other, man and woman, nature and culture. And these dualisms form the coherence of Western subjectivity. So the cyborg stands in direct opposition to Western subjectivity. So to be a woman, for example, is not a biological fact. It's a full ideological coherence. So you have to look a certain way, you have to think a certain way, you have to act a certain way, and most of all, you have to desire in a certain way, right? You have to relate to the world via ideas of maternalism, softness, and subordination, for example. And similarly, to be a man requires mastery and autonomy and aggression. So these are not private identities, they're socially programmed perceptibilities, but we've already thought about this with Judith Butler. So Haraway's Cyborg intervenes in the need for identity cohesion. So she writes the following: cyborgs do not recognize the Garden of Eden. They are not made of mud, and they cannot dream of returning to dust. So this is an explicit rejection of origin myths, whether religious, political, or psychoanalytic, as we talked about before. So these origin myths seek to bind subjectivity into fixed historical, biological, and structural narrative, and this is a rejection of that. So a cyborg, it doesn't return to nature. It can't. It has no proper place. This is the ontological scandal that Haraway is proposing, right? It's the same scandal found in Stirnerian and Deleuze. It's the refusal to be located. Then in the next part, she talks about gender as a site of disassembly. So she says there's nothing about being female that naturally binds women. So this is a direct attack on the cohesion fantasy of gender identity, and it very much echoes Judith Butler's famous claim in Gender Trouble, where she says, there is no gender identity behind the expression of gender. Identity is performatively constituted by the very expressions that are said to be its results. So both thinkers insist that gender is not something we are, but something we do. And that doing is always haunted by contradiction, parody, and instability. But Haraway goes a little bit further here, and it goes a little bit more into the direction of ownness. So the cyborg doesn't just subvert gender, it refuses the logic of identity altogether, which kind of reopens the idea of claiming ownership of gender. So its body is a patchwork. It's machine circuits, biological tissue, symbolic programming, corporate residue, digital traces. It's completely ungrounded. So this is the becoming imperceptible of gender. It's not simply identifying as a gender or deconstructing gender, but ceasing to be readable as gender. And this very much echoes Deleuze and Guattari. So the idea is that becoming woman or whatever is not imitating a woman, but going through a becoming that eliminates the binary altogether. And so to become a woman for Deleuze and Guattari is not to transition into womanhood, but to abandon the privileged coherence of the masculine subject, right? To undo the grammar of subjectivity. And the cyborg's gender is unprogrammable, right? It's not non-binary as a category. It's actually category breaking through ownership, right? It's a rejection of any linguistic fixity that isn't self-determined. So Haraway writes, cyborg politics is the struggle for language and the struggle against perfect communication, against the one code that translates all meaning perfectly. So perfect communication equals total legibility equals surveillance equals capture, okay? This is where becoming imperceptible and ownness converge, because they both evade translation. But this is complicated, because how can owning a gender, how can me saying I am a man today and I am a woman tomorrow, how can that be disconnected from the symbolic? How can that be disconnected from surveillance and legibility and capture? Well, let's think about that part where Deleuze and Guattari say to paint oneself gray on gray. The cyborg is painted in the gray zones of reality. So it doesn't appear as a fixed shape, right? It flickers and it glitches and it scrambles. It passes through layers. Not to reveal like a core, but to show that there never was one in the first place. So becoming imperceptible is not the invisibility of stealth, okay, but the highlighting of inconsistency, right? It's what Haraway calls the illegitimate offspring of militarism and patriarchal capitalism that refuses to be disciplined by either. Cyborg politics is a becoming nobody, okay? Not the liberal subject asserting their identity, but the egoist withdrawing from all definition. So Haraway writes, the cyborg skips the step of original unity, of identification with nature in the Western sense. So that is, the cyborg has no ground and has no need for authenticity. It's all effect, it's all interface, it's all artifice, right? This is Jenna's domain because it's about the self-created, self-consuming unique. Now again, let's bring Jenna's ownness as something like the unspookable cyborg in the mix, okay? So in the ego in its own, Jenna says something like you're an eternal idea and therefore always a burden to yourself, right? Always a spook. Haraway's cyborg would reject man just as much as woman as fixed coherent ideals. The cyborg is Jenna's dream realized in a sense. It's a self without essence, it's being without obedience, and it's like a life without a name. So Shinna calls for the despookification of all fixed identities. He writes something like, away then with every cause that is not altogether my cause. So this is exactly Haraway's critique of ideological feminism and essentialist biology and also technological determinism, right? Every claim that says you are this because of your body or you must do this because of your kind is a spook, right? It's a ghost of the ideal trying to possess the living. So the cyborg rejects all these causes. It doesn't serve any program. It operates on stolen hardware, corrupted code, and illegible purpose. And this is the ethical genius of Ownness. Right? And it's also what makes it so difficult to understand for a lot of people, I think. It's not to destroy spooks because they're bad, but because they're not mine. They're not owned by me. They're not my choice, my decision. They don't originate from me. And one more time, there's something really important here, which is what I treasure in Shinna so much. It's the focus on the dangers of rebellion that boils down to visibility and capture. So Haraway is aware that rebellion itself can be co-opted. So every new identity, every new flag, every new gender performance can and will be captured. And it will be marketed, and it will be mapped, and it will be policed. So this is why becoming imperceptible also means to accept that. Becoming imperceptible can't mean to rebel against that on a consistent basis. Becoming imperceptible is not refusal. It's withdrawal from the very conditions of legibility. So the cyborg is not a rebel waving a banner. The egoist doesn't want to be praised for nonconformity. They want to live outside the game entirely. There's a quote by Haraway where she says, we're living through a movement of an organic industrial society to a polymorphous information system, from biology as destiny to biology as strategic confusion. And this strategic confusion is the terrain of the egoist cyborg for this thought experiment here. So this is one who makes their body unreadable, makes their mind uncapturable, and their identity unmarketable. Not through rebellion or refusal, but through withdrawal from the meaning that is imposed on them. Alright, now to wrap it up, let's move toward a Stirnerian cyborgian concept of self, which isn't related to coherence or cohesion in any way. What the fuck is this imperceptible being? Like, what does it look like? What the hell am I talking about? Okay, so this being has no ground, no god, no gender. But that doesn't mean that it can't own whatever the fuck it wants to own. Okay? Not because it's like anti these things, but because it has no need for them. Okay? So that doesn't mean you can't own the gender and play with the gender and utilize the gender. It just means that you have to own it, otherwise it owns you. It also has no stable politics. Okay, this is important because politics begins in the fantasy of shared use. Politics is about cohesion, which is a counterbalance to incoherence. And we don't want that. Now, also, there's no heroic narrative. There can't be a heroic narrative because narration requires coherence. And lastly, I would say this is a body of ownness, okay? This is not natural, not virtual, but stolen, appropriated, hybrid, recombinant, selfish, joyful, whatever. So this being does not scream, I exist, but rather, again, in the sense of becoming imperceptible, flows in ways that escape existence as recognition. It is the drift of becoming, okay, the fading trace of desire. It's the laugh of the egoist in a machine they don't believe in. It's kind of like, in a sense, giving up the idea of attaining anything, of getting anywhere, of fixing the lag, okay? That is the place where this starts. So Haraway Cyborg is kind of the face of imperceptible ownness. It's not simply a feminist icon. It's the emblem of the disappearing egoist, the one who ceases to be anybody, and thereby can love, act, and enjoy without spooks altogether. So becoming imperceptible is not annihilation. It's liberation from being for others. So Haraway, Deleuzo-Guattarian, and Donna all agree on this radical truth. Only what is unnameable can truly be mine. Okay, friends, that's it for me. Please have a look at the links in the description. We still really need your help with our project because honestly, making these episodes and working on the design and everything is really kind of getting a lot for me, and I really could use some help and support. I think we can make this pretty worth it for many of us with the right tools. This is going to be a space where you can easily access anything you're looking for in terms of Stirnerian content. So please have a look at the links and see if you can offer your support, even just by sharing or commenting or liking or subscribing, whatever. I hope you have a wonderful week. Remember not to let the spooks get you.